Nationwide, cities and states across the country are moving the needle on police reform. Just last week, Governor Cuomo signed the repeal of 50A and banned the use of chokeholds. Today, we continue that discussion. What can happen next to innovate in policing? This is One New York.
Welcome to One New York on this Monday morning. We have a lot to talk about with our guest in just a few moments. She'll be joining us, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney, to talk about police reform, defunding the police. And there has been so much talk about this lately, in part because there's been so much more interaction with the police. We have seen weekends, or at least this past weekend, full of protests. It's been now, I don't know how long these protests have been going on. Has it been 2 whole weeks of this already?
And it's interesting because there is equal passion now among the protesters as there was at the start. And when, Jamie, you mentioned the interactions with police, this weekend it took on a different form than we had seen very much of in the past, and that was how much are police going to intervene when it comes to social distancing and following the regulations that the state and city have put in place to stop the spread of coronavirus.
It was interesting, too, what the governor said, because after touting the repeal of 50A, after touting his demand that every jurisdiction in the country come to him by April 1st with a plan for police reform, he said, protesters, your work is done, or something to that effect. I can't remember the governor's exact words, but I understood where he was going with that. But there's so much more to this, and this has been so long. You have to forgive the protesters if they believe that their work is not quite done yet.
I mean, they're talking about a sea change, and that doesn't happen. Look, obviously, I think they would say that those are steps in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But as you point out, it's not time, as far as they can see, or they seem to be, their words or their acts are living up to this, that they're going to pack in and just go home and say, okay, that's enough.
No, I think some of the things that he was touting might be considered tiny victories, sure, but like you said, they're talking about systemic problems. We can show the new Black Lives Matter mural that was painted over the weekend. There's going to be one in each borough of the city. This is the first one that went up in Brooklyn along Fulton Street, and it goes all the way from Brooklyn to Marcy Avenues. And, you know, yes, you might say it's just a mural, but I feel like with each passing day, we see a little tick in the change, in the terms of the big changes that eventually they want to see. I mean, yesterday there was this massive rally in Brooklyn for Black trans lives, which is something that you might not have seen, you know, even just last year at this time if the same sort of thing was taking place.
Here's one of the comments that we got from a protester on the weekend, not specifically addressing the governor and as to why the protests could wind down now, but just explaining why they're out there every day, because the message doesn't really change from day to day. Part of the message is the consistency of the message.
We're fighting for all the injustices that the system has already put on us. We're not just looking at one thing. We're not looking at just George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. We're looking at the entire system that needs to be changed. The entire system needs to be redone.
And that's what we're hearing over and over again. It's not just 1 or 2 changes that are going to get us there. And we're seeing this across the media as well. The new New Yorker cover is really emblematic of the push that we're seeing that's being demanded. You see George Floyd there with all the others beneath him that led to this point. What did you guys think of that?
I thought it was really powerful, and I really liked when you scrolled through the digital version of it, you could sort of scroll through and touch on each face and each story, because again, what we're talking about is racism, something that has been going on since the beginning of time. And so this is something that's going to take a little bit more than just, oh, one great weekend of protesting and, oh, yeah, like the governor said, go ahead, you won, you can go home. This isn't about a little win or a lose. You know, this is about really big changes. And part of reading those stories and, you know, part of like the Say Her Name campaign and, you know, knowing these names and knowing these stories is about understanding how deep-rooted this is and how much grief and anger and emotion there is in all of these stories.
So the focus for this hour, or as much as we get of the hour before the mayor comes up sometime after 9:30, is innovating in policing and innovating in the relationship between government and the community. Because as we've seen highlighted in so many ways by this, that relationship is broken. There aren't supports in the places there need to be supports. The police are being asked to do things that the police weren't supposed to be asked to do. And this is my long way of tying in two of our top stories this morning. All of the people out on the streets, in front of bars and restaurants on the weekend. And we saw the video from the East Village on Friday night, which was particularly obvious in terms of the number of people out there having drinks, no masks on. So when I talked to the police commissioner this morning, I said to him, I said, is this an example of a situation where the police are the ones who are called in to rein this in? And should it be that way? Or should you be the ones that are telling people after being locked down for 3 months to go home, take your drink, don't drink your drink in the street, don't visit your friends? That may be one of the fundamental problems with police, that we put them in these situations where they have to crack down on people, and it puts them immediately at conflict with people who they're ultimately meant to help.
We have to take a look at what's going on right now, and we have to examine top to bottom, I believe. You know, how do we police this great city? And just because we have put a lot of these reforms into place already and been on the cutting edge, and I think we're a leader for other police departments, not only in this state, but the entire country. I think it's an opportunity to continue to examine your practices and look for other areas of reform.
Yeah, and he was saying that he hopes that businesses can sort of police themselves in those situations, that they know what the rules are. They know when they look outside towards the sidewalk that if there's crowds like the ones that we saw on St. Mark's Place, that that's not okay, and that they should be the ones responsible to tell the crowds, hey, break it up. And that once you bring the police in, it automatically becomes more of like an altercation of sorts, even if they're just called in to try and peacefully break it up.
I mean, it's not a 911 situation, you would hope. This is where they could call 311 or nothing at all, be able to figure it out themselves. And that's so much of the time. What the problem is that the knee-jerk reaction is get the police in, and then the tension rises, the conflict rises, and it leads to a bad outcome. And that is what this whole defund the NYPD and calls for reform in police departments across the country are seeking to avoid, to change that whole narrative or the whole way that that process happens. And maybe the police are not the best ones to take care of a lot of these situations.
Let's dive into this topic with Lucy Lang. Lucy Lang is the director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. Has spent a lot of time looking at police reform and what needs to be done for police to get along better with the community and for there to be better outcomes for the community. Lucy, thank you for joining us. You have studied these topics for a long time. Have you ever seen the intensity for reform that we've seen in the past 2 weeks?
I think that a lot of the family members who've lost loved ones to police violence would say, we've seen this before. In fact, we've seen it over and over again every time there is a tragic incident. Of course, the volume seems to be increased from past times, and the sustained nature of it seems to be increased. So I think it's incredibly exciting that we're seeing folks galvanizing around it. But for the families who have been through this time after time, I think that it's incredibly important that we deliver on some of the progress that has been promised each time there has been a tragic incident.
Can you talk about the years that you were an assistant district attorney in Manhattan versus where an ADA might be sitting now? Has there been any change from your years up until what you're seeing now, or are we still sort of stuck in the old ways of doing things, and there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of criminal prosecutions?
Well, one of the major changes was the 2015 executive order that vested authority for prosecution and investigation of these matters in the Attorney General instead of in local district attorneys. That was codified in law last week in the spate of legislative changes, and that is generally speaking a best practice, because even when local prosecutors are able to objectively conduct investigations, the optics for the public are simply untenable. And at a time when the legitimacy of government institutions, including the police departments and prosecutors' offices, is very much at stake, it is far preferable for there to be a statewide body, which we now have in New York and have had by executive order since 2015. So the way I see it, part of what needs to change at its core isn't just a question of policy, but really a question of culture. And so one thing that prosecutors can do in their daily interactions with police is to ensure that people are spoken to and about with dignity, to ensure that the whole community is being treated equitably and fairly, and to make sure that police officers are complying with all of the standards of communication, transparency, and compassion that we really should expect from all of our public servants.
We should definitely expect that from everyone, but what you're talking about, changing the culture, I mean, you're trying to fix racism, basically, systemic racism. That's a massive undertaking.
It's true, but I don't think that it is something that we can wait on. It's the fact of policing in this country that it evolved out of the legacy of slavery and slave catching. And what we really need is a culture that is more oriented in and around communities. So some parts of the defund police movement aren't about abolishing the police entirely by any means, but really are about taking some of the resources that are traditionally dedicated towards law enforcement and vesting them in pro-social community engagement for police, or investing them directly back into communities and into some of the other kinds of resources that communities, in particular communities of color in this country, have historically been deprived of.
We need to take a quick break, Lucy, but when we come back, you're the director of the Innovation in Prosecution unit at John Jay, and I want to talk a little bit about what some of your studies and research has shown are best practices to advance the cause of criminal justice. Stay with us. This is One New York. We'll be right back.
Lucy Lang is our guest on One New York today. We're talking criminal justice. She is the director of the Institute of Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay. Lucy, if you could take a step back for us and explain what that institute does, and do you have a particular position as you innovate in prosecution?
Our organization works with prosecutors and communities across the country who are seeking to implement criminal justice reform through prosecutors' offices. So we really are looking to elevate practices that prioritize safety, equity, and human dignity, which has in many ways been critically missing from the criminal justice system throughout American history. So with respect to this particular area of work, and all of our areas of work, we bring in both elected district attorneys, legal scholars with expertise, and directly impacted community members to try to solve the thorniest problems in prosecution.
And so you've gotten together a bunch of these people who are all touched by it in some way, and you created a toolkit to sort of help. I guess there's prevention, and then there's also after the fact how to get to prosecution. But let's talk through the toolkit a little bit. I know we have some of this here that we can look at. And what here do you want to highlight for us?
I think that the portion about ensuring thorough, transparent, and timely investigations is really one of the top priorities here. A huge component about this is making sure that prosecutors are communicating regularly and compassionately with families and communities that suffer these kinds of egregious trauma. The data piece, although far less funded, is also really vital. There is a huge gap in how much local prosecutors collect data. And the more we know about areas of prosecution where there are racial disparities, the better we can prescribe race-neutral, preferable policy outcomes.
And have you seen some of these points implemented and put to practice? And what kind of outcomes have you had?
Well, two of the prosecutors we worked with nationally were prosecutors who had, in fact, investigated and prosecuted police shooting cases. One was the prosecutor who handled the case against the shooter of Philando Castile, Ramsey County District Attorney John Choi, and that case resulted in an acquittal. So we used that to inform part of the development of our toolkit. Another was the prosecutor of Portsmouth, Virginia, Stephanie Morales, who successfully prosecuted a police officer in her community who killed someone. And we learned a lot from studying State's Attorney Morales' work on that case. And so much of it was that she was able to build a successful case because she worked deeply and in a sustained way with the family and with the community, and really brought to it almost an interdisciplinary approach to working on the case. So it was not strictly speaking about the law, although of course that is the foundation of any prosecution, but that she also brought to it a victim service, a sort of social work orientation, and thought about it as an opportunity to increase trust with her community. So we based part of our work on the experiences of those prosecutors.
As you talk about it, one of the problems that stands in the way of reform is that there are so many jurisdictions in this country for law enforcement. You'll have small town sheriff's offices that are 10 people. You'll have big city police departments that have 30 or 40,000 cops, and every one of them needs this data set you're talking about. Every one of them needs these procedures, and they're integrating with how many countless numbers of district attorneys. It's almost impossible to get your hands on the amount of reform that has to happen.
Pat, that's such a good point. There are 2,400 elected district attorneys around the United States. So when people talk about the criminal justice system, they're really talking about a sprawling set of systems that were never really designed to work together. So when we try to imagine a new system of criminal justice, a new system of policing, we're not talking about a set of changes that's going to impact a single entity, but rather thousands of different structures that need to be changed. And that's why I think the culture change piece is really so important. And one of the important lessons that we took in our work building this toolkit was from the moms who had been working on this problem for so long. We brought together New York City moms who've been suffering for decades, like Kadiatu Diallo, who's Amadou Diallo's mother, Valerie Bell, the mother of Sean Bell. We had families of far more recent heartaches, Victoria Davis, the sister of Delron Small, Eric Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, and moms from across the country like Valerie Castile, Philando Castile's mother, and Wanda Johnson, the mother of Oscar Grant. And what these women really said was that they did not trust that change would happen. And even when they see the protests now, they are both heartened and disheartened because of the patterns that we've seen.
Yeah, because it never ends. They see the same thing happening to other people's families that happened to theirs. I totally understand where these mothers are coming from. We do have to take a quick break. Hold on, Lucy. If you want to ask any questions or send in your comments about police reform, please use the hashtag #OneNewYork. We'll be back after a quick break.
Welcome back to One New York. Today we are talking police reform and criminal justice reform. And of course, at the start of this year, New York enacted bail reform on January 1st. And I just want to show you an op-ed that Police Commissioner Shea wrote in the end of January and read you a quote from it. He said, last April, New York State's legislature passed an ill-considered set of criminal justice reforms that were buried in the state budget bill. As those reforms have taken effect, it has become clear that they present a significant challenge to public safety. And Pat and Jamie, he wrote that as at the time when we were starting to see a little bit of an increase in crime.
Yeah, the discussion was a different one at that time, but the same underlying issues and the questions of how quickly do you reform, at what price does the reform come. I was talking to Police Commissioner Shea about this morning. Obviously, a man in a very different position than when he wrote that op-ed. Here's what he said on the topic of reform this morning.
We have to take a look at what's going on right now, and we have to examine top to bottom, I believe. You know, how do we police this great city? And just because we have put a lot of these reforms into place already and been on the cutting edge, and I think we're a leader for other police departments, not only in this state, but the entire country. I think it's an opportunity to continue to examine your practices and look for other areas of reform.
Our guest today on One New York is former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney Lucy Lang. And Lucy, I hope you heard what the commissioner said and also what he had written in that op-ed. What do you think about that?
The issue at stake in bail is actually not dissimilar to the core issue that we're talking about here about changing in policing. It really is a question of what kinds of resources we are going to dedicate towards these problems, especially now that coronavirus has highlighted for so many people the terrible conditions on Rikers Island. We're realizing that many people who have criminal matters pending need support to be able to come back to court, and perhaps should not be simply released with nothing, but that the traditional response, which is detention, is simply no longer aligned with our values. And the same is true with so much related to policing, that we have a traditional way of responding to all kinds of cases, and so many calls that come into the police are to respond to issues related to mental health or other health conditions. And we have to equip government agencies with the whole range of skill sets to be able to respond in those cases. It is not a question, to my mind, of it's either this or that alone, but really what can we create in the middle to help support people, give them the support that they need in ways that are non-criminal, but that help address underlying issues that drive conduct that undermines the well-being of the whole city.
But Lucy, there's a report on the weekend that with the number of Rikers inmates released because of coronavirus concerns, that the NYPD was seeing some of them arrested again within a few days. There was one guy, the example in this report, who 4 different times the NYPD had picked him up because there was some other alleged offense, but they weren't holding him at Rikers, so he's back on the street again. That's not a good cycle.
It's certainly not, and that speaks exactly to the fact that there needs to be a full system of supervised release in between simply releasing someone on their own recognizance and holding them at Rikers Island. We need to be building out social programming, using community-based resources to help prevent that cycle in and out of the system that we see over and over again.
We're going to take a quick break, Lucy. When we come back, we're going to hear from the mother of a victim of police shooting. We will be right back in just a moment. This is One New York.
As ugly as it was and as nasty as it was, it's not isolated. This type of behavior by the police has been going on for hundreds of years. His murder was the straw that broke the camel's back, because we've been going through this and fighting for this and talking about the same thing. We've had so many working groups. We've had so many recommendations. We've done this, we've done that. We sat and talked. I've sat and talked for 4 years, but here I find myself again.
That is Valerie Castile, mother of Philando Castile, who was shot dead by police at 32 years old. And Lucy, that was part of a Zoom forum that you held with some mothers of children who had been shot and killed by police. And you hear her talking, and we talked about it earlier in the show about how this is a cycle and that they keep seeing the same pattern over and over again. And so I guess the big question is this time different?
I take great inspiration from Ms. Castile and the other women we've worked with who are in her equally heartbreaking position, that maybe now with something like the governor's executive order, where we're tying funding to sweeping reforms that are designed by police departments locally, but in conjunction with their community partners, that we may be able to see some real change, and that maybe this time, in fact, is different.
And so their voices are amplified again because of the recent tragedy of George Floyd. But we talk about criminal justice reform and also defunding the police. What element is there of that has to do with police training so that we don't get to these situations in the first place?
Well, when you think about the fact that police are essentially trained in a paramilitary fashion in this country, and in some other countries, they're trained in ways that are much more consistent with the lessons of social work and education, and wonder whether there might be some kind of middle ground that we could hope to incorporate. I think that we should be learning from police forces other places in rebuilding police training curricula.
And then to put the piece of the prosecutors into it as well, it's part of the system that the police have these interactions. The prosecutors have close relationships with police. They want to be appropriately skeptical to make sure they have a good case, but they are relying as the police as their eyes and ears for some of these events. What happens at that next level as prosecutors review these cases and try to figure out, is there a bias, or is that bias apparent to them?
One of the big challenges in many of these cases for prosecutors is that, generally speaking, statutes are incredibly deferential to the standards of what's often called the reasonable police officer. So where the legal assessment is about whether or not the police officer was justified, it's based on what that officer understood at any given moment of the interaction. And those can be very, very difficult cases to prove. So I do think that that's one reason that the law is often not on the side of charging and proceeding with a prosecution in these kinds of cases.
And I'm wondering, with the intensity of the protest movements, the intensity of every time you open up social media now and all the calls for justice, how much does all of that tip the scale at all?
Well, as we talked about earlier, prosecutors and police are public servants at their core, and so they should be, and I think are, listening to calls from communities to begin to rethink their practices. That said, good policymaking isn't made based on a single anecdotal incident. It's made based on studying things over the long term. Now, a long-term analysis of this tells us that about 1,000 people nationally are killed by police officers every year. And so that alone should suggest that there is some intervention needed.
Jamie, I thought I was going to go through an entire hour without saying Donald Trump's name, but here I go.
Here we go.
Well, because your question brought to mind the fact that now Trump and the Trump campaign have decided that they are on the side of law enforcement no matter what. And we're back to this polarized situation. And this isn't, whatever solution exists for improving criminal justice, for the Black Lives Matter movement, for eliminating racism, it's not going to be a two-sided, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat issue. The solution just doesn't exist in that world. So where does it exist if that's what we're being pushed to by our political system?
One of the unique things about the system, as we discussed, is that we vest this authority very locally here in the United States. And we're the only country in the world that elects our prosecutors. So our local DAs are directly accountable to people who vote, which is why it's so important that people turn out to vote in those local elections. But it also reflects this particularly American sense that these matters are best addressed based on local mores. So that's something that is very much to the good about the changes that we will hopefully see in the course of the next year as the executive order begins to be implemented, that local jurisdictions will begin to work with their communities, address very specific and localized concerns, and then create tailored solutions that take those things into account. Because really, it's a very big country, and our law enforcement needs are incredibly varied depending on jurisdiction. So I do think that the uniquely American nature of the way we've built this set of systems is part of what can ultimately be the solution.
And Lucy, it's also such a uniquely American problem, though, because our history of slavery and racism in this country is not like you see elsewhere in the world. So when you look overseas or abroad to best practices and you can implement those in terms of police training and the reforms that you are going to incorporate in your proposals or your suggestions, how do you reconcile those two? Because America has such a different set of issues and such a different type of history.
It's a great question, Annika, and I would add to it that the other piece is that because of our Second Amendment protections and the number of guns in this country, that we have an armed police force, which also distinguishes us from a number of other countries that we might take lessons from. So on that front, de-escalation training, the banning of practices that we know are disproportionately likely to result in serious medical consequences or deaths, like chokeholds. Those kinds of very specific policies are things that can be implemented now and should be in order to that take into account the problems that you've raised. That said, exactly as you say, it is a much bigger and more complicated problem than law enforcement alone. It's an economic problem, it's an educational problem, and we shouldn't be thinking about these issues in silos. I do think that one of the big mistakes we have made in criminal justice reform is trying to reform specific subsets of the criminal justice system instead of calling upon public housing and public schools and other social service agencies to collaborate in coming up with solutions.
Because there are so many facets to it. When we come back, Lucy, we do have to take a quick break. I want to ask you about every person being armed with a cell phone now and how the videotaping and the filming of some of these incidents has really changed everything. We'll be right back. This is One New York.
This would normally be the time of day when Mayor de Blasio comes to the podium at City Hall and would interrupt this program to deliver his daily coronavirus briefing. Just a few moments ago, the mayor's press secretary said he woke up feeling under the weather. He is going to take the day to recuperate. He will be working from home. That means no City Hall coronavirus briefing today. We will continue with our conversation on One New York.
Yes, and we are talking to former Manhattan Assistant DA Lucy Lang. And I want to talk to all of you for a moment about how cell phones have really changed the game. I'm not sure if all of you watched the multi-part breakdown in the New York Times last week of the killing of George Floyd, but I thought about how years ago this never would have been the case. You never would have been able to see all the different angles interspersed with the maps and the 3D imaging of, you know, the whole event broken down for you in such a way. And I know, Lucy, that you talked to some of the family members of people who have been killed by police and how it's a pattern of over and over and over again. And I want to play a soundbite first from a sister of a man that was killed by police and about how what she compares some of these videos to.
It's extremely triggering that they're happening on video, and it's like people are being lynched and everyone's buying a ticket, except for you don't have to buy a ticket anymore, because you can log on to your Facebook or Instagram and someone has inboxed it to you.
I mean, so we've been talking about how this affects prosecution and relations and everything, but there is a massive emotional toll to all of this.
That's exactly right. And Victoria Davis, who's the sister of Delron Small, speaks so beautifully about it in that clip. Imagine if you had had the worst possible thing happen to your family, and then every time it happened again, your inbox became flooded with images of it happening to someone else. So on the one hand, these videos are powerful investigative tools, And they also are powerful in their capacity to rally the public around this incredibly important issue. But at the same time, I think that there is a downside to it, as Ms. Davis says, which is that it almost runs the risk of fetishizing this terrible recurring tragedy.
But something about it holds the police accountable in a way that they never have been before. I was talking about the George Floyd video. The fact that you see nearly 9 minutes of this without an interruption takes away the ability that the police have had in the past to say, yeah, that's true what you see on the video. No one made that up, but what you didn't see was what happened at this moment that wasn't on the clip. This clip is the entire thing.
That's absolutely right. And the other piece of this is body-worn cameras by police officers.
If they're turned on.
If they're turned on, absolutely.
Yeah.
As they should be in encounters with civilians. But a study of body-worn cameras in Washington, D.C. reflected that, in fact, body-worn cameras did not seem to change how police interacted with the public. But exactly to your point, Pat, it changes what we know about those interactions. And ideally, it changes the capacity for prosecutors to ensure that they are held appropriately accountable and that a complete investigation is done with as much information as possible.
How often do we see police departments change their statement of what happened? Oh, he was resisting arrest is the first statement. Then the video comes out. Then they dial it back. I mean, that seems to be a recurring theme that we see, Lucy.
Sure. And in the investigation of any crime, initial statements often evolve over time as evidence comes out. And the sad fact is that that can be true in officer-involved cases as much as it can be in the investigation of crimes committed by civilians. But of course, we do and should hold police officers to a different standard because they're sworn to protect.
Lucy, I'll come back to a point that I've heard time and time again in the last few weeks from people who are in law enforcement. They say, this is a hard job. We're not perfect. There are a few bad apples. And a lot of that is true. How do you still allow them to do their jobs, but also make reforms that can eliminate cases like George Floyd and Eric Garner and Philando Castile?
It's a community-based solution. It has to be. It has to be about getting cops closer to the communities they serve, about ensuring that they are attending community meetings, about incentivizing them to undertake mentoring, coaching, tutoring, the kinds of things that we know form different relationships between police officers and community members. So the solution in some ways is probably not going to be found at the system level first, but rather at the level of figuring out ways for individual police and individual community members to connect in meaningful ways, see each other as full human beings, and hopefully that will begin to chip away at the kind of adversarial structure that has developed so tragically in this country.
We are getting a lot of live comments on Twitter and Facebook as people watch on different streams here. Lucy and HP Alexis on Twitter says, I don't think anyone is against police reform, but what I see completely left out of the discussion is the perspective of cops, not police executives, but street cops who are in these critical situations. Their input is valuable, but no one seems to want to speak to them. We're going to take a quick break here on One New York. We've got more with Lucy Lang right after the break.
Welcome back. We are talking police and criminal justice reform today on One New York. And there's, of course, the one side that feels like reform of the police department, defunding the police department will lead to a spike in crime. There is an increasingly loud voices on the other side that's saying this is a solution to end some of the disparity that we've seen in terms of policing in the city. And we have Emily on Facebook, one of the live comments coming in saying reform is not enough. Cut police funding by 75%. If their job is so important, they will make do with a smaller budget, using it wisely, as social workers, educators, and other direct services have for decades. We are joined by Lucy Lang, who runs the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay. And Lucy, your thoughts on that? 75% seems like a big number to cut. But what do you think about the defunding movement of the police department?
I'm in favor of diverting resources to positive community engagement, whether that looks like diverting them within the police department or sharing them with other community-based organizations and social service agencies, I think has to be dependent on the needs of a particular jurisdiction. And to Jamie's question that came in a little bit earlier about, is anyone asking the beat police officers what they think about this? I think that's a very important one as well. I had the incredible privilege to work with police officers very closely for many, many years in my role as an assistant district attorney. And I was regularly impressed at the degree of professionalism that those officers showed. So I do think that we need to bear in mind that the majority of police actually also want some kinds of reform, often want body-worn cameras because they want proof that most of their interactions are peaceful. So we need to keep that piece in mind. But police reform really fits in this much bigger picture of criminal justice reform. And one of the questions is just what cases come into the system and who gets punished, but how do people get punished? How do we respond? What are the values? And one of the things that I find most compelling coming out of the pause that the system has been on during the course of COVID-19 is the idea that we might be able to build a system that incorporates principles of restorative justice, that is more about what a victim feels after they have been harmed and what a victim wants after they've been harmed, and then potentially bringing those voices together so that there is some real accountability rather than simply strict, punitive, traditional responses.
Lucy, it's been good to have you with us today for your insights. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to see you all.
Annika and Jamie, as I listen to the final thoughts from Lucy, I'm reminded of conversations that we have in so many different contexts about New York, which is that the way you've been doing it is only the way you've been doing it because that's the way it's been done. And that restart, that rethinking is so hard, but sometimes it's the best thing.
Yeah, and it seems like we're
own...
at that point right now to question all the traditional ways and what best practices can we find and implement and what can we shed that hasn't been working.
Right, and it's come from such a dark place, but this is an opportunity that you don't get very often to rethink everything and reimagine how things are done.
If the momentum continues. The momentum's been continuing on the streets with the protests, but it's only if the momentum continues that the change continues. Otherwise, it's another example that you'll refer to when the next killing happens. So we will see where this goes in the next week or two and continue to cover this story for you. Once again, as we wrap up, we let you know that you will not see Mayor de Blasio in this time slot today. The mayor woke up not feeling well, decided that he is going to take the day off, so there will be no briefing from the mayor this morning. Governor Cuomo's briefing is coming up. We'll bring it to you live when it happens.